Professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz, to the leadership retreat, which is taking place at our institute. I'm also happy to tell you, Rabbi Yeshaya, that there was a groundswell interest that the high school students, Kita Yud Aleph, said, could we have the privilege of sitting together, and you couldn't ignore the criticism he posed. You couldn't ignore the alternative ways that he believed the country needed to develop into. You could disagree, you could argue, you could be irritated, you could be angry, you could be in a rage, whatever it may be, and I think he loved that. But one thing you couldn't do is ignore him. The might of the intellectual integrity and the commitment that he has both to Judaism and to his people is total and was really awe-inspiring for myself. So I begin. And Rabbi Yeshaya once said to me, David, since we are so close, the disagreements between us are very interesting. Now, so what we will be seeing will be possible disagreements, agreements or not, but I will begin by posing questions to Professor Leibovitz, and then the dialogue will go, and then afterwards the audience here as well could begin. First of all, as an initial opening, what do you believe occurred to Judaism as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel and the entrance of the religious political structure establishment within the governmental framework? Isn't it a wonderful thing that we have a state which can now become instrumental in bringing Judaism to the masses? Do you see this as a blessing, or do you see this as a possible mistake?
The state of Israel isn't the state of Judaism, but the state of the contemporary Jewish people. Judaism is not a Muslim state. The meaning of the state of Israel is to be a framework for the political and national independence of the Jewish people. Of the Jewish people as this people is. Not of people ought to be such. The problem of the state of Israel, the problem of Judaism are two absolutely different things. The problem of the state of Israel is a pure political. The problem of Judaism is the deepest problem of the Jewish human being. And this effort to be seen in Jerusalem as in Manhattan or in Buenos Aires.
In other words, as far as you're concerned, the issue of Judaism, or the problem of Judaism, and its relevance for contemporary Jew, there is no particular issue that you believe that Israel has affected regarding that, and that problem exists wherever Jews are found, and that we have to view the state as a reflection of the way Jews are, and not necessarily.
There are Jews who think about the fact that they are Jews.
Here,
And in Buenos Aires.
okay. Now, so do you think that the state itself has brought about a greater opportunity for the renaissance of Judaism, has made an impact on its potential vitality either here here or around the world?
Yes, state with the potential, not in actuality, concerning Jesus. Nothing in the promise of Judaism has changed. One of Judaism is the fact that for this human group, numbers today would be 12 million, 14 million human beings. They are conscious of the fact that they are Jews and are also governed by the Goyim as Jews. There are today no common elements in their way of life or even in their spiritual life that are common.
So how would you define today the Jewish people? What does it mean to say there is a Jewish people?
As I told you, there are today about 12 million or 40 million human beings. The majority of them sincerely conscious of the fact that they are Jews, but there are today which means since the 19th century, no connection with the state of Israel, they are lacking the common features of their existence, the common features of their spiritual. I don't know today neither concerning the way of life, nor anything concerning values, beliefs that are common to these 12 million humans.
So what binds
That's the crisis of the Jewish people and of Judaism.
Did everyone hear that?
No.
Oh, we're working on it. What, you want to hold the microphone? So that you hold it so that people can hear. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I would like Rabbi Yeshayahu once again to define what he sees as the crisis of Judaism and the Jewish people today. Into the mic.
Well, I repeat, there are today about 12 to 14 millions of human beings.
Our field is Judaism, not sound system. We're getting the jobs of the general community.
Yes, I know. We shall learn.
We have a general message.
Good.
Who and his great majority of them are conscious of the fact of being Jews and are also regarded by the Goyim as Jews, but they lack today. Today means since the 19th century. Without any connection to the establishment of the state of Israel. They lack common features in their life, nor in the world of spiritual life, values, aspirations, beliefs, moral obligations. which means that it's impossible to define today what Judaism means. There is today a dissociation between Jewishness, which means being a Jew, and Judaism, which means a specific content of Jewishness.
Okay, now if we take this distinction, in other words, what you're claiming as a very important feature, because then the state of Israel has to be understood within that context, that with the 19th century, a consensus, normative consensus broke down. Agreed upon notions of authority broke down. The content of our Jewish life as an organizing framework broke down. And therefore you could not say that there is a specific content that defines this community. But what does happen, which you call Jewishness, is a desire to be seen as a Jew, to be identified with the community, although this identification does not bring with it a specific commitment and content. Am I understanding you correctly?
I'm not so sure whether the majority of this 12 to 14 million people have the desire, but they are conscious of the fact that they are Jews.
In other words, you would then say that the Jewishness is an awareness, but not necessarily a commitment to want this to be a continuing feature of their identity.
Probably not for the majority.
Not for the majority, okay. Now in that context...
Certainly for our guests here. That's a cause for them.
Okay.
Because they have a desire to get some Jewish content of their Jewishness.
In other words, the guests who are here, our community, have a desire for that content.
Our community, by our community.
Our community of here. Yeah. In other words, now here is a very crucial notion for Professor Leibovitz's philosophy. The desire to find content, the hunger to give that content, before even it becomes formulated, has a very profound value. Am I understanding you correctly? Okay. Now, and you claim that the desire, in other words, that desire is not necessarily reflective of the total community. The desire is a remnant. The desire as well, the yearning to give a content to that identity, is not necessarily expressive of where the whole people are. Now, in that framework, would you say that the state of Israel reflects the desire of an enormous community to want to continue Jewishness?
No, not at all. To have political and national independence. Absolutely independent of the content and the meaning of Jewishness.
Wasn't there an ideology? No, here's an interesting radical position. You're saying that the establishment of the state of Israel does not express any desire even for a content for one's Jewishness. Am I understanding again?
Exactly.
Okay. Now that's a very radical statement to make, because one would assume that the longing for that political independence is an outgrowth of some commitment to the continuity of Jewish history.
No, not at all. Not at all. Expression, the fact, some Jews, they are substantial part of the Jewish people. In the part of the Jewish people, in the second half of the 19th century, they are fed up with being ruled by Goyim. That's the meaning of Zionism. To be fed up is being ruled by Goyim, without any connection with what the meaning of our traditions, what do we desire, what do we aspire to have our nation independence, to have the opportunity and the right to commit our own follies, our own crimes, and certainly to be responsible for that.
All right, now, here's where the interesting discussion begins. Last night, we had the opportunity to listen to Menachem Brinker and Avi Revitsky, which was a marvelous evening on the ideological foundations of Zionism. I didn't hear from either of them. I mean, there seemed to have been, if your thesis is correct, that Zionism should have not presented any ideological problems. All of them didn't want to be ruled by the nations of the world. All of them wanted to seek some degree of self-determination. So there should have been no problem. Yet, if I look at Zionist history, there were enormous ideological debates. There was a...
There are not debates within Zionism. There's debates within the Jewish people and Judaism.
But can you make that distinction? Now, how do you make that distinction between a debate within Judaism, a debate within the Jewish people, and yet say that that's not a debate in the way they perceive this state that they want to establish? Isn't there a debate on the content of their national identity? Can you say that the national identity is value neutral? Seems to be a radical thesis that you seem to be arguing, and I take strong issue with that. In other words, it was not just a desire to establish a state. There was a debate as to the content of that state. So Israel reflects a deep debate in the content of one's Jewishness, and not necessarily...
The same debate exists in Manhattan between Jews who are conscious about their Jewishness. The problem was the content of Jewishness, or the meaning of Jewishness. It's exactly the same problem in Manhattan and in Mersharim in Yerushalayim.
Okay. I understand, and so we have a clarity as to what the possible disagreement may be or not be, but you are therefore, in terms of that, let's get very concrete. There's a strong issue which the diaspora faces on the who is the Jew issue. And there's an attempt on the part of the government to refuse to give the opportunity to people converted by reform or conservative. In light of your definition of the desire to give content, you would then see in the reform and the conservative movement also a serious movement for the giving of content to Jewishness, yes or no? How would you view these alternative movements in America?
For me, they don't represent what I consider to be Jewish values.
But do they
They
represent...
have no common notion of Jewish values.
There is, you don't have a common, but do you see them seeking Jewish values?
Yes, certainly.
Now, is there therefore something in common with you because both of you are seeking? I'm not saying on the content, but in the seeking, are you together?
Don't find the same answer to this question. And there's the same here and there. Consider the situation here. Here you have two, both of them sincerely conscious of the fact and each of them also recognizing another fact. And this the acceptance of all Torah and mitzvot.
The acceptance of the yoke of the commandments and the Torah.
And all Torah and mitzvot doesn't pertain to a world of ideas, but to material existence. The fundamental fact of the being human existence is the fact that man is an animal that eats. And for one of them, even eating is connected with acceptance of Torah and Mitzvot. And therefore, he demands some specific arrangements in the kitchen and in the table. For the other fellow was exactly the same consciousness of being a Jew. All Torah and Mitzvot doesn't mean anything, or even rejected by him, constantly rejected. And so these two Jews cannot eat together at the same time. The second instance, you have two Jewish families. Each of them deeply and sincerely conscious of the fact that they are Jews, and they can't intermarry. Because for one party, it's either he or she, which doesn't make any difference. Sexual and marital life also gets its meaning, its importance, by acceptance of all Torah and Mitzvot, which means in this case to acceptance of Dinei Nida and Tzilah, who impose themselves third or half a month, every month in the life of him and her. The other party, whether it's she or he, doesn't make any difference, doesn't accept this discipline of sexual and marital life. This discipline that doesn't have any moral meaning, or social meaning, or national meaning, or philosophical meaning, but has a meaning of acceptance of all Torah and Mitzvot. This party doesn't accept it, and so cannot be man and wife.
So in other words, you're claiming that the desire for Jewishness does not yet create a unified people.
No, not at all.
Not at all. So that there will be serious divisions within the Jewish people as to how one will give content to the. Should the state of Israel in the who is a Jew?
What's it? No connection to the problem of the state of Israel at all.
So what's about the law of return that the
It's the
Knesset?
same problem in Manhattan.
Yes, so why does the state do that? How should Reform and conservative Jews in America feel when they come in, they say you cannot come here on the law of return if you were converted by a conservative Reform? How would you respond to that?
That's the problem of the state of Israel, not the problem of Judaism. The laws of the state of Israel are the laws of the state of Israel, not the laws of Judaism. The state of Israel is a 100% secular state. The laws of the state of Israel are not the laws of the Torah, but the laws of the Knesset. And the Knesset has exactly the same connection to Judaism as American Congress has to Judaism.
Aha! I mean, you would say that this is, in other words, so when Brian Lurie, you can quote that. Now, So Shamir and Bush have much in common. Now, I would ask you then the following. This is wonderful. Now, let me just ask you. Yitzhak Shamir,
whom I consider to be a disaster.
a disaster.
He and me, with exactly the same sense, desire the political and national independence of the nation.
So what you share with Shamir,
But I have no common values. No common values at all.
except that, is that a value?
This desire.
This desire, is that a value to want to have political national independence for the Jewish people?
It's a value for a fascist.
It's a value for fascists?
I'm not fascist.
So then why then do you choose to want that independence? Is that a fascist desire?
No.
Okay,
The fascist desire, if it's elevated to the rank of a value.
in other words, if it's elevated to the rank of a value, it becomes fascism. If it's what else then? If it's not value, but what?
A thinker of the 19th century.
A what?
A thinker of the 19th century, a Mona, warned about 140 years ago, in 1848, the year of the great national revolutions in Europe. He warned about a way leading from, I'll give you exact translation, he was going away from humanity through nationality to bestiality. Away from der Humanität durch die Nationalität zur Bestialität. That's the way the German people, 100 years after him, really went to bestiality. And that's the way we have started to go 24 years ago, in 1967. By turning the state of Israel from being a framework for the political nation defense of the Jewish people into an instrument of violent domination over another country.
In other words, you have warned the community of the profound risks and dangers of nationalism as a road towards bestiality. Could you indicate why do you believe that nationalism is a profound risk to create this type of bestiality, in which the paradigm for you is what happened to Germany? What is there about nationalism that so frightens you?
Nationalism is frightening if it becomes a value. Nationalism, for people who are not fascists, is a fact, existential fact. I am a Jew. That's a fact. between some human group different from other human groups becomes the value, the criterion for the sightseeing thing. What are values? That's really the shirt. Habituation is the fact that's naturally given. Naturally given. 5 billion beings exist today are not in unity, there is differentiation between them. That's a fact, not an ideology, not a theory, not a belief, not a case. But the moment the nation becomes an object of faith, of value, then becomes
Let me now begin to look at that thesis, because I have difficulty with it, and let me indicate the difficulty I have. When you make the point that the distinction between an existential fact and a value, you want to make a claim that nationalism is an existential fact. But if it would be a fact, nationality, yeah, but nationality is something I can choose. Facts I don't choose, I discover. The fact that I can choose to belong to this nation and not to another nation makes then national identities a reflection of freedom of choice, which takes it out of the realm of facticity and givenness, and then places it within the realm of value. Now, one minute. There is a difference between the nature of the value I give it, the weight of that value, the priority, its ultimate hierarchy in the structure of my values. If I make it so ultimate that it becomes more important than human life or more important than other things, I think we could make any value, friendship, love, family life, I could make anything that I value into bestiality if it blinds me from the complexity of other values. Why do you see in national identities, and I don't see that, in other words, the choosing to be a member of a nation is not an existential fact. It's a decision of how I want to live my life, identified with which history, which culture, which language, which in a sense is a realm of value. Why do you see this as bestiality? If I'm prepared to admit a limited scope to that value and not give it a sense of ultimacy.
Exactly what I said. But you don't understand.
No, you remind me when I was a young rabbi that every time that people didn't understand my sermon or disagree with my sermon, my claim was they didn't understand it. No, you feel, Bob, that he...
I think he was saying what he was saying. He's saying that nationalism has had a tendency to be aggressive, for which reason he distrusts that part of it. I think that's what he's saying.
Is he understanding you better than I am? Go ahead, Bavakashai. Help me understand, Shai.
You understand absolutely correctly. But you don't understand that that's exactly what I said.
In other words, you admit then that your membership into the Jewish people is not just an existential fact, but it's a choice of Leibovitz. You have chosen to be a member of this people. You have chosen to be a member of a group that decided to end the exile. So in other words, your Zionism is not a fact, but a value.
Born in Shanghai, I never would have needed choice to come to us. what you do in my church. The first thing I do is give to me, and I choose not to change the situation. I accept the fact that I am good. And in common with many other groups, not with all groups, but a substantial part of the Jewish people, I have the desire to have our political and national independence.
Okay.
And there is no value.
I tell you, I don't want to push you if there is a value or not. If we agree about, what you can say no value, I think you mean by that no ultimate value or absolute value in the sense, and the fear. That would lead me then. In other words, just in terms of a concrete framework, what do you think Jews who are members of the conservative movement, reform movement, reconstructionists or secular, how should they react to the state of Israel when they're told that their congregations and their rabbis cannot bring Jewish people into the Jewish community, and if they come to Israel, they will be rejected on the basis of the law of return? If they came to you and said, Professor Leibovitz, what do you believe our attitude should be? What would you
Try
advise?
to overthrow the government here. And these are the laws of the government of Israel. What a problem today.
It's not a problem of Judaism. In other words, they should not feel that their Judaism is being rejected. They should feel that they're being rejected by a political state, which is a purely secular decision.
The state of Israel is a 100% secular institution.
Would, Rabbi Lurie asked, Brian Lurie asked, would you reject them on the law of return if they came here? In other words, you would subscribe to the law of return. Would you welcome them into Israel on the law of return? That's his question. Not Shamir. He's asking Leibovitz.
I'm asking it to Judaism.
What do you mean by welcoming?
Welcome. Now, Ryan, would you like to?
I don't even want to enter into the state of Israel. I want to enter into Judaism. That's to me is the profound piece of what he said. Do we share together Judaism? I'm not a traditional Jew. In the 19th century, I went a different way, in a matter of speaking. You continued in the halakhic tradition. Can I?
And what do we share?
That's what I'm asking you.
Should I tell you what we share? Okay, let's go. Here comes a very serious issue. This is the issue, correct? That is the issue.
Not the laws of the state of Israel.
Not the laws of the Pope.
What do we share?
That's right. Okay, that's the issue. In other words, let's get something very clear. Leibovitz gives no credence, spiritual credence, to the delegitimatization of the conservative reformer by the State of Israel. The State of Israel has no religious power, significance. It has the same function as the Congress. It's a secular law used by bad law and should be overthrown. And if he's the head of the UJA of America, and if the Jews of America say we're not going to give money to Israel as long as you have that law, what do you suggest about that policy?
A religion or religious movement that asks for legitimation by secular power is in two aspects.
What? A religious movement. This is very important. A religious movement that seeks legitimatization from a secular government loses its value as a religious movement. More, it loses its reason for existence.
So therefore, the 20 people in the Knesset have really delegitimatized themselves. The religious parties.
Right, no.
So he.
So-called religious parties.
So Brian Lurie's question is that the
An
20th.
integral part of the secular government.
So they are an integral part of it. So there's no religious parties. They're not religious when they're part of the government.
So initially you said there were
departments of the secular administration.
So in other words, there is no notion that a secular government speaks in the name of halacha. So when the religious parties will say, how can we give back territories because it's against the halacha, how would you respond?
From the point of view of the halacha, not Israel has no right to exist.
What do you get that? As far as the halacha is concerned, the state of Israel has no right to exist. Can you explain that to me? It's a bold statement. I hope the Arabs aren't listening.
I tell the same thing to my Arab students.
Now I understand. Okay. He says he tells it to his Arab students as well. So I said, now I understand. Go ahead. What do you mean by that?
There is a secular state. Therefore, it's possible from the point of view of halacha.
Why? I mean, halacha doesn't say that Washington has no right to exist. If the United States has a right to exist, the halacha doesn't say that the United States hasn't got a right to exist. So the halacha should not state that Israel has no right to
The
exist.
Goyim have no obligation to observe the Torah.
Good, but you see, you're contradicting yourself here. Watch what you're doing, Bible. You are saying,
Bush is all right. Yitzhak Shamir isn't all right. He's Balavera.
yeah, okay, Shamir
Bush is not Balavera.
okay, Bush is not a sinner, whereas Yitzhak Shamir is. Let's say, but is Yitzhak Shamir, what you see, you just said before. Now listen carefully, I'm not usually saying, just help me understand you better. On one level you say that the state has no value. It is a neutral reality in which you have decided not to be ruled by the Goyim. That decision, not to be ruled by the Goyim, and to have political self-determination, you as a halakhic Jew made that decision.
What is a halachic Jew? He's a human being.
Yes, but you're also a halakhic Jew. You would not do things against the halakha.
But the problem of statehood is not a problem of what religious problem is.
Good. Oh, so I'm saying if it's not a religious problem, then you can't say it's puzzled by the halakha. You can't say that the halakha rejects the state if you maintain that the state itself is not a value. It's a neutral phenomenon. Halakha doesn't say it is or it is not. But you see, like Shia,
Administration and the laws of this state are averot.
the laws. How? The laws, not the state.
The state is neutral.
State is neutral. So the halacha does not say that the state has no right to be. That's all. Let's agree on that.
State is governed, administrated against the Torah. It's a state that has abolished Shabbat. The state that has abolished Shabbat. The new Shabbat is legal to see.
Oh, a minute. But you wouldn't want the state to say that you shouldn't. You see, you wouldn't want the state to say that Shabbat you're not allowed to ride, because that would make the laws against Shabbos riding a secular law, because the state is secular. So the state doesn't say that Shabbat riding is wrong or right, because it can't, because it's a secular state. So when it says you should ride, it's not saying, I mean, when it says you can ride in Haifa, or that you can ride in Tel Aviv, it is not making a halachic decision. It's acting as a secular state. So therefore, it is not uprooting the halakha because it has no power. It doesn't speak in the name of the halakha for it or against it. So therefore, the state in no way is contrary to halakha. It is beyond the halakha because it is totally secular.
What is not secular is how this state is governed and administrated. Which means that if you accept Roma B'Shemayim Rotaro Short, must be in a fundamental, permanent opposition to this government and this administration. But Jewish religion here, I mean the official Jewish religion, is the kept movement of the secular government. And the so-called religious parties who are part of this government are simply the pimps of this horse.
Okay, now I just wanted our leadership to understand the mild metaphor that Leibovitz uses in our society. You understand that he doesn't receive the Men of the Year award from the Agudas Yisrael or the Mavdal. But the point is the following.
You see, that's exactly what Ben Gurion told me about 40 years ago. I had many talks. And never were friendly. Ben Gurion rejected my demand for separation of state and religion. Why? אני רוצה שהמדינה תחזיק את הדת בידה.
Translate, I want the state to control the religion under its power.
And that's exactly the situation here concerning the official Jewish religion. These two human beings who are called Rabbanim Rashiyim,
Chief Rabbi, these two individuals are called, yes?
simply officials of the secular government.
They're officials of the and therefore for you they have absolutely no religious authority.
Exactly as the director of the Department of Customs.
Of transport. In other words, you then, this whole notion that the state has a chief rabbi, which gives a voice to Jewish law, for you means what?
A prostitution of religion for political interests.
Okay. Now, if this is clear, we see, in other words, for you, Rabbi Yeshayahu, the role of a religious party or community should be in opposition and critically present a different option of how the Jewish people should live and should not be co-opted by a secular government.
Exactly. As the whole history of the Jewish people. Every time Jewish people had stated, this was for many centuries in biblical times, and for about 80 years during the Beit
Second time around, yes.
The entire history of this Jewish states, biblical states, and the state of Yeshayahu was struggle between Judaism and the political power. And that's what we understood very well. He had told us in my pretty long life.
Oh, just a young life that life. You should go visit Santiago. Oh man,
89 isn't it?
89 is not sure. Okay.
I came to have a relation with all groups and all trends of Jewish. From Korenim and Me'asharim to the Kibbutzim of Shomer. I never met a man who hated Judaism, I mean historical Judaism, from his soul to his heart, as
Ben Gurion.
And that's why he rejected the inspiration of state
Religion, Judaism. He never met, in all the people he's met, and here Leibovitz can be quoted on this, from all the groups he's met from the left, Shamat Zayir then, has never met an individual with such a profound hatred for historical Judaism as Ben Gurion, and it is for that reason, claims Leibovitz, that he wanted religion to be part of the state. Do I understand you correctly? In other words,
ought to have a religionist independent factor.
but then how did you feel about all those people who dance and celebrate and say that the state is the beginning of the Messiah and having power is an instrument of God's redemptive? I read books in which people were saying that the 6 Day War, the signs of the Messiah, the footsteps, Rabbi Amital wrote, Be'ikvot HaMashiach, etc. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I lack communication with heaven. I don't know what the meaning of the state of Israel is from the point of view of heaven. But I know what state of Israel means from my point of view.
In other words, you have no connections.
I don't have any connection with heaven.
I see. In other words,
And nobody has. But there are so many scoundrels who pretend to have it.
Okay, now, in other words,
For instance, some Admurim.
some Admorim, some Hasidic, he prefers not to clearly articulate which ones, but you see them as in some way, but they claim that by talking that way they're bringing Jews back to Judaism. They are awakening hope, and they're telling the Jews, light Shabbos candles.
The phenomenon of Musea Sheker in material art in Jewish history.
The notion of false prophets is an integral part of Jewish history. Now, if this is your position, I'd like to conclude the discussion, which is only a beginning, with Lurie's question, which concerns Jews in America and us here. He says, I chose in the 19th century a different path. A choice. Deep desire to continue his Jewish identity, a deep desire to continue Jewish history, but does not feel that that content of that choice requires submission to the authority of Orthodox halachas. He then asks, and 80% of the Jewish world asks, or 80% of those who seek, not 80, most 80% don't even ask. Do they share, are they part of Leibovitz's community? would Leibovitz welcome them in some way and say, we share together something, or are we like two separate people?
We are both Jews without sharing any common thing. Nevertheless, we are both Jews. That's the Christ problem.
Okay, now let me ask you this final question. But Lurie would then come back to you and say, excuse me, Professor Leibovitz, we do not share. We in the Reform movement are deeply committed to a notion of covenantal theology. We are deeply committed to belief in God. We are deeply committed to the rejection of idolatry. We are deeply committed to live on the Shabbat, not completely the way you do, but in the seventh day of the week, we know that this is a celebration of God as the Lord of creation. We do not share a common halacha, but we do share a common agada. We do share many, many things which infuse your framework. Can't you admit that there is a way in which Jews can share a common language spiritually without necessarily sharing a common authoritative halakha?
No.
You quoted me very nicely.
Okay, now it is, I want you, the last no.
It's a matter of fact, not of ideology.
It's a matter of fact, not
It's a
idea.
matter of fact. We have
Not
no
ideology.
common way of life, and we have no common beliefs.
Okay, now I would now recommend both to our people of come and to students, it is on this very central issue that Yeshaya and myself deeply disagree. And he has been my Bar Plukta, the person who has haunted me since I've come in Aliyah to face that position. I have attempted to discover an understanding of Jewish commitment, which does not necessarily have to exclusively find expression within the material, what he calls the material reality of halacha. Not that I'm not committed to the halacha, but I believe that there is a meta-halachic framework which creates a sense of Jewishness. Rabbi Yeshaya, we disagree about Maimonides in that. We disagree in many levels on that. And I pray that he should have many, many years to...
You said, what we share is that we altogether believe in God. For me, believing in God means acceptance of all Torah.
Except that the Torah
means
says
somebody tells me and he says quite sincerely he believes in God. We believe in one man in heaven who draws the strength of the world.
Now, I want to say that I think belief in God can have a content independent of the authority of the Orthodox community in halacha.
Without Torah,
Oh no, what do we mean?
God means believing in somebody who draws the strength of the world.
Yeah, I would say it doesn't necessarily have to leave that. And this would, I would say to our people who are here to that, the second phase of the discussion with Leibovitz and Hartman will be in our discussion of what content do we give to the meaning of idolatry. Can belief in God find expression in the rejection of idolatry? And the Gemara says, Kol ha'kofar avodah zarah ki l'moda b'chol ha'torah kula.
Which means Islam.
Okay, now, we may therefore have new foundations for building brotherhood between Jews and Arabs. Anyway, I want to personally share with you.
Arabs is not Judaism and Islam. It's the Jewish people and the Palestinian people.
I want to personally, to Shaya say, thank you for coming. And would you like to say to our people a parting shalom or...
Yes, certainly. I heartily say shalom. Heartily and sincerely. Certainly for our group. That's your problem.
Thank you for coming. Okay, there will be Daniel, do you want to take it over in terms of the group?
Okay, for those who are staying now for the study sessions, we divided into 3 groups. If there's any names of people who I left out, please come to me afterwards. There's going to be a break now for about 15 minutes, and the groups will start at 5.
What we realize is the strange phenomenon is that what unites us, we think it's Judaism, but there's nothing that divides us more than our Judaism. And for a Jewish people, it's sort of a strange thing to wake up to one day, to realize that in a deep sense, people is the myth, or unity is the myth. Who are we? It's a very complicated question. If we can start, I'd like to start together on in the text on Tractate Yevamot, page 14a. It's on page 7. Page 7. There's a fundamental aspect of surprise. One of the reasons why we get so angered sometimes when Judaism seems to create boundaries between Jews and it shouldn't be. It's like you always hear the notion, even though it's absolutely irrelevant. Isn't it enough that they killed us? It's like, it's like it shouldn't be happening here. It's like it doesn't belong. It's not that there's a philosophical argument. Initially, there's just a fundamental feeling that it's wrong. That the sense that the Jewish people are divided by their religion is just simply wrong. I don't know why it's wrong. I can't tell you philosophically it should be, because if you think about it, when it gets worked out, maybe it makes sense. Maybe it's nice that we might have a myth sometime that we all came from Sinai and we all were one. But now, in fact, there are some fundamental basic differences. And as you remember, as we said yesterday, and very often, like you remember when the Reform movement was many years ago, was given permission to perform marriages and divorces in the state of Israel. As rabbis, the only difference was they said you can't do it as Jews. Christians are able to perform marriage and divorces, no problem if you would do that. We're willing to give them we want it as Jews. If you want it as Jews, it's the only one we have to talk about. But I know, like for myself and when I teach people, we talk. There's a fundamental instinct that this is wrong. And what hurts us the most is when we meet other Jews who don't have that same fundamental instinct. It's like this thing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's obvious to me that I shouldn't accept you. And so the biggest schism is, in a sense, between people who just can't even understand how you would let something like Judaism separate you, and other people who just can't understand why you can't understand the point. So, is that clear? And so in many ways, when we're studying texts, we're talking about something which has already been decided on a very different level. It hasn't been decided philosophically. It hasn't been decided on the basis of some text which people have studied. There's a basic schism in the sense of whether, in fact, it makes sense that there should be a schism. And what I would like to look at are texts which attempt to bridge some of that schism, to deal with it. Are there ways of dealing with it? Are there ways of building some shared language? Which obviously would then demand that people would be so predisposed to realizing that this is a problem that they should overcome.
Isn't there something more about we should understand initially that there can never or should never really be a unanimity, a total unanimity, because then you get no fresh thoughts.
You see, that is correct, but unanimity never exists in the tradition, even within Orthodox. In other words, even the people, you see, we'll see. If you study, we're going to look now in a moment at the Talmud is filled with diversity of opinion. There's no opinion which is ever accepted by everybody at any given time. Even when we attempted to codify Jewish law in the 16th century with the later codification, which was supposed to end all discussion, the Shulchan Aruch, he sets forth the table for the whole Jewish people. Along comes a printer and we print his opinion and we say, that's fine for you, Sephardi. But the Ashkenazim act differently. We print on the bottom the words of the Ramah, how he disagreed with the Shulchan Aruch. And then a book called the Mishnah Berurah becomes printed. On the bottom of the Mishnah Berurah are about the 20-25 different practices, in fact, which different communities have observed and have become legitimate, which differ slightly from what the text of the Shulchan Aruch says. So there's always is diversity of opinion. The problem is to what extent. Where does it stop? It's not the simple notion of diversity, but what happens. Who's inside and who's outside? And the question is, how do you determine who's inside and who's outside? We're going to try to see that as well. Are we all, any other questions? Or okay. I'd like to look at one of the most fascinating texts that I've encountered. Yes, just hold. Let me. Okay. There is a Jewish law which says that you're not allowed to scar your face. You're not allowed to. Basically, the notion is you're created by God. This world and your body, it's like you're a renter in this universe. Like you have a rented. You can't be very careful. If you make a hole in the wall, it has to be repaired. It's different between owning a house and renting it. And that's what the whole notion of creation creates responsibility towards the environment, towards your own body. You're not allowed to scar your face. Now the rabbis learned that not only not allowed to scar your own face and your own body, you're also not allowed to scar the face and body of the Jewish people by creating divisions. Look, godet is the term. Don't develop substructures and subdivisions within the community because you're scarring the face of the Jewish people. Now the question is, does diversity of practice create scarring on the face of the Jewish people? Could we have one Jewish people even though we have diversity of practice? Where did the discussion come from? It comes from two scholars, Hillel and Shammai, who disagreed on everything each other said. I'm not familiar with one opinion. I've never seen it recorded. It might be recorded once, where Hillel said something and Shammai didn't disagree, or vice versa. Hillel v'Shammai shnehem omrim. Hillel and Shammai both said. I'm not familiar with that in all of Shammai. Every time Hillel says one thing, Shammai says another. Shammai says one thing, Hillel says another. And the question was, did Hillel and Shammai follow their own legal practices? Shammai gave one ruling and Hillel gave another ruling. So what did they do? If both of them practiced differently, did that constitute the scarring of the Jewish people? Could we have practical diversity? This was their question. Now, there's a debate. Some say that Shammai practiced according to what Hillel told them to do, and some said they didn't. Now let's pick up this discussion. Now, as to the others who maintain, who'd like to read? Tom?
Now, as to the other who maintains that they did act according to their views.
In other words, according to the opinion that Shammai followed its rulings and Hillel followed its rulings, in other words, we have two norms of practice within the Jewish community.
Should not the warning law tikatzedu, you shall not form separate sects, be applied?
Are they scarring the Jewish people? Are they destroying this notion of having one Jewish people by having more than one practice? Before we go on, does everybody understand the text? Everybody together? Okay.
Abaye replied, the warning against opposing sects is only applicable to such a case as is that of two courts of law in the same town, one of whom rules in accordance with the views of Bet Shammai, while the other rules in accordance with the views of Bet Hillel. In the case, however, of two courts of law in two different towns, the difference in practice does not matter.
What's the answer? What's Abaye say? Be careful.
You're not in the same community, then they can't
Then,
lots of diversity.
and then, very good, and then what is permissible if they're not in the same community? You can have two forms of practice. In other words, the Jewish people could what? Have more than one mode of Jewish behavior as long as what?
They don't divide the community.
As long as you don't divide the community. As long as I don't see you and you don't see me, the fact that you're different than me doesn't create that schism. You could be where you want to be, and I could be where I want to be. But, he's arguing, in the same community, what do we have to have? We have to have absolute unity. Absolute unity. You can't have in one community diverse expressions of Jewish life. And that's why you would go to a city, any city, you pick a city you live in. From Muskegon to Milwaukee to Toronto to Montreal, there exists Orthodox conservative reform within that community. Fundamentally, that's going to be a divided community and it's forbidden.
Forbidden.
Forbidden, and it's a violation of Jewish law. Now, who has to give up? Is the question. He doesn't say that. But I was saying, the existence of that diversity is going to, in fact, create schisms and hatred and a scarring on the unity of the Jewish people. Each community must have one shul, or one legal, many shuls, but one legal authority which decides the norms of that community.
But there's no such thing in the world.
There's no such thing. No, you're right. We're going to see, but he's not. But what he's saying, you're correct.
Can there be different communities within a city?
No, well,
there are.
Could be. That could be. Now, we're going to get to that in a second. He says no. He says different towns. And the notion is that you can't see. And the reality is that our experience in North America and wherever there is that the diversity does in fact create division. We haven't succeeded in creating a pluralistic society. You don't let me here, it's rare. You don't let me in, I don't let you in, etc. There's all the one-upmanship. The fact is that diversity creates division within the Jewish people. I'm not marrying you, you're not marrying me, I don't want to care. Why aren't you giving to me? Everyone seems to insights in one town. But if we would take this as a model for the state of Israel, for example, what would it say? Let's try to be creative on the now and think. According to Abaye's theory, how could we enable some notion of separation, of pluralism within either America or within Israeli society? What would he be pushing for? How could you? Because the fact is that the Jews are disagree with each other. So what do we have to do, basically, then, if we want to follow Abaye as a model for how the Jewish people should live?
But Abaye was never confronted with the state of Israel. There's a big difference. For instance, if within a city like Jerusalem, it wasn't a state of Israel, there was no Knesset, you have the Mea Shearim at one end, and at the other end you would have the Reform Movement's temple, and which could also be in a district, and which people living there would probably mostly be Reform Jews. That doesn't mean that there would be conflict in the same town, and there would be conflict in the same town. But in a sense, it would not create a problem because there was not one state. Like the state itself is now apparently involved today. Now, in Abaye's time, there were ghettos, and therefore there was no question. You could have one town with just one synagogue reformed, another town, one synagogue Orthodox. Now, the point is that within each town there would be no difference. It would be peace. But if you cross into another half a mile and you have the other town, what happens? Would they enter, a boy meets a girl from the other town, there would be a problem.
Right, that's what we're going to have to look now. One of the cases we're going to look at, what happens when a boy meets a girl from another town, what do they do? But what Zal is basically saying is that if you attempt to institutionalize and to make a uniform system of religious observance for a whole, a la the state of Israel, you couldn't function this way given the diversity. How could you function? Is you have to create small nucleus communities. You speak that way, Michael Walsh. Michael Walsh speaks. I want to create small nucleus communities. Michael Walsh was a leading political theorist in North America. Small nucleus, each one is its own community. Because he has this whole notion you can't separate community from its values. There's no separation of state and religion. State is the expression of the values of that community, and therefore it's an arbitrary distinction. It's called communitarian as a theory. He said the communities have to embody what they think is important, but let's create small nucleuses. We have a reform nucleus, and then there's no problem. The problem is when we try to build it in this one totality. Therefore, you don't try to build it within in Israel, because how can you have one Israel? Am I going to be the one who rules, or are you going to be the one who rules? That's impossible. You can live as long as
each one should have their own laws within that small community.
Each one in the area of religion. In the area of religion. In the area, and how you create and define what constitutes an area of religion and what constitutes an area of state is a big, big problem you're going to get into. But that would be what it's a difficult one. America struggles with it. It's like there's gray areas, but certain basic distinctions. He says, you have to understand what Abaye is saying, that pluralism in a deep sense is fundamentally impossible. Because if you see the other person you're living with disagrees with you, the two of you are not going to be able to live together in this wonderful unity and overcome and ignoring your differences and saying, you're a human being, I'm a human being, you're profound and I'm profound, we can live together, not respect. You're different than me, I'm different than you, we're going to threaten each other, we're going to end up with creating crises. This is what I'm fighting. And therefore, as long as I don't see you, we can do it. It's an interesting statement about human nature. And history has tended to verify it. Rava, however, disagrees with that. No, you're right. It wouldn't be fit. It would be. But then what do we do? Let's talk about that in a moment. After Rava, I want to get back to your question of cognition. Said Rava.
The fact, however, is, said Rava, that the warning against opposing sex is only applicable to...
No. Said Rava to Abaye.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's a little bit beforehand.
Surely the case of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel is like that of two courts of law in the same town.
So what's he saying? Your theory is what?
They should be separate.
Separate is nice in theory, but what are you trying to
Fact that they're living in
explain? You're trying to explain how Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree. The reality is that just like today, Beit Shammai, we didn't have divisions of communities where we have one community like this, another small community. They lived together in the same ghetto as well. They lived all together. So your theory might be great. It might be great. It might be an ideal statement about what should be. It might be an ideal statement about what should be, but in fact, that's not what exists. The Jews intermixed with each other in diversity. People could talk to them. So what is happening? And Rava comes up with another theory on how to create it.
The fact, however, is, said Rava, that the warning against opposing sex is only applicable to such a case as that of one court of law in the same town, half of which rule in accordance with the views of Bet Shammai, while the other half rule in accordance with the views of Bet Hillel.
Okay, but in the case, however...
In the case, however, of two courts of law in the same town, the difference in practice does not matter.
What does he say?
He's drawing the distinction closer. In other words, how can you live in the same community instead of separate communities?
Okay, so what creates the scarring on the face of Jewish? What creates divisiveness in the Jewish people?
Differing opinions, perhaps for the same individual.
Now let's first be literal in the text, and then let's try to see what we think about.
If a court of law uses two codes,
If there's another, what is the battle? In one court of law,
well, I think he's saying if the codes that are followed, the rules that are followed are separate, or are unified and consistent in a court of law, that's fine, even if they're in the same community. But when the codes differ, when there are two codes that are followed in the same court of law,
Practice does
then
not matter.
they're starting.
what's he saying? We have two groups of people. You're close. We have two groups of people, both of differing opinions. When is it going to create divisiveness if we have only one what?
One court of law.
One court. So then what is each one doing? What is each one fighting to do?
Win over the case.
To do what literally?
To dominate.
To dominate the courts. The fight is over who is going to control the one single court. If, however, there's two courts, and then there's no fight for what? For dominance over the court, then it's matter. Now, what does a court symbolize? What does a court create? What are we fighting? If I want a court, if I want to control the court, what am I looking to create? Law and what else? Authority, legal authority, legal foundation for what I want to say. In other words, if both are fighting for legal authority and there could be only one victor, then it's going to create divisiveness. If each one, however, has its own source of authority and is not trying to undermine the source of authority of the other, then there won't be divisiveness. So according to what creates the divisiveness? The existence of diversity of opinion? What do you think creates divisiveness? According to Abaye, what creates divisiveness is human nature. It's human nature. We just can't see. What creates it?
The desire to dominate.
The desire to dominate. Not the existence of two opinions. It's a very big difference. Diversity is tolerable. It's how you relate to the opinion which differs to you is what's going to create the scarring on the face of Jewish.
But if you carry it further, then two courts would be
be better than one court because there would be no dominance.
No, not agricultural. That's exactly what he's saying. That's exactly the point.
But so two communities, I mean, carrying it to this day, is better. Two kinds of Jewish communities, or three or whatever, is better than one.
And absolutely. And in that sense, unless everybody happens to agree, which doesn't exist, but the existence of people who differ demands the creation of multiple sources of authority. And the only time we will have a scarring is when you attempt to dominate. What is the classical case of the violation of the principle of rabbi within the last 2 years?
If one wants to dominate the other.
What's the classical case that blew everybody up?
It was a Jew.
That's exactly what happened. There was one person who said, I want to create. See, in America, very often, you're in your court, I'm in my court. The truth is, you don't have authority over me, I don't have authority over you. I have space here. When one wanted to dominate all the rest, then there's a blow-up. I can tolerate you, I don't know how long, but I can handle it. And so in many ways, it's exactly the state of Israel which creates the problem in the contradistinction to what Rabbah says.
Rabbah says you can go to your own court of law. If you want to get a jurisdiction, you go to your court of law.
And then correct.
But
So you're
Israel
gonna-
only has one court of
That's the
law.
problem. When it comes to religious matters, there's only one court of law. And there's only one voice which seems to represent the Jewish people, and that's what people say. Excuse me. Diversity's fine. There's no danger. The Jewish people can handle diversity. We have a common destiny, we have a common history, we can be different. Just don't attempt to dominate, don't attempt to be the sole authority. You attempt to do that, then you're violating Jewish law and creating a scar.
So how would they respond to it? How would they interpret it?
They would say like this. This would be their thing. And we're going to get this, and this is going to help us get into the next. How are they going to argue? They're going to argue. That is okay when you're dealing with Hillel and Shammai. Both of whom, let's turn to the last page here. Should be the last page, or just the race track that they will be. The 13b, the second to last page. What's the page? Page 9. This is a text which many of you have seen already, but we'll just read it quickly. Rav Abba stated the name of Samuel. Who'd like to read anybody?
For 3 years there was a dispute between Ben Shammai and Bet Hillel. The former asserting the halakha is in agreement with our views, and the latter contending the halakha is in agreement with our views.
Then each one is arguing. One says, I'm the law, and the other says, I'm the law. I'm correct, or you're saying this one says, I'm correct.
Then
a bat kol is a voice from heaven. Excuse me?
What page are you reading?
We're reading on page 9 at the top.
At the top, all right, sorry.
A bat kol is a voice from heaven.
Issued announcing the utterances of both. The utterances of both are the words of the living God.
How would they answer, Sylvia? They would say, only those opinions which God sees as the words of the living God are ones which we will tolerate and create in the context of plural, of diversity of opinion. A Beit Hillel and a Beit Shammai I'll tolerate. But to compare Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai to the conservative form of Orthodox movement is a travesty of justice. That would be the argument. You can't compare. What would they base themselves on? Turn to page 1.
Both Shammai and Hillel would have used the same source to begin with.
Right. Or whatever the argument would be, for example. You know what they do? They then try to find distinctions, phony distinctions sometimes. Some of them are, there's real distinctions, but they try to identify certain key components. Like, for example, their statements like, Hillel and Shammai both agree that Torah comes from Sinai. Now, nowhere would you see the coming from Sinai, Torah comes from Sinai, as a necessary criteria within the Talmudic discussion for this discussion to take place. There are certain things in the sense that you can say the Reform movement doesn't accept halacha anymore. If you don't accept halacha, you're in a different ballgame. So you can't claim that you're like Hillel and Shammai. That would be a more adequate. There is grounds for making that distinction. One of the major reasons, or one of the major texts that could be pushed and quoted, is this text from Mother Rizal, which is on page 1. Yes? Anybody who'd like to read? Now, I'd like you to read from the second to last paragraph, Rabbi Abba who cited to Rabbi Yochanan.
Rabbi Abba?
Page 1, yes.
Recited to Rabbi
Yochanan.
Idolaters and Jewish shepherds, small cattle, need not be brought up So they must not be cast in.
Okay, let me tell you what's going on here. We're talking here about a pit. Someone falls into a pit. Should you help them? Some people you can throw into pits. Some people who are in pits, you should help out. Some people are in pits, you can walk by and say, sorry, you're in a pit. Ultimately, you're going to die. It's very, very demonic text. It's a very difficult text. The text is, they're saying idolaters and Jewish shepherds of small cattle. Now, Jewish shepherds of small cattle, the idea was that if you're a shepherd of small cattle, you're probably a thief. Because small, it's sheep, etc., they need to eat. And in all probability, they're going to be eating in someone else's land. So these are people who fundamentally have no respect for other people's property, etc. So the text here is idolaters and Jewish shepherds need not be brought up. If you see them by those, if they need your help to save them, you don't have to help them. Though they must not be cast in, so you shouldn't throw them in. So they're not, it's like, okay, keep on reading.
But meaning informers and apostates may be cast in and need not to be brought up.
Now, apostates are those who, one of the principal apostates are people who could possibly not accept the world to come, don't accept. A lot of the theological statements of Judaism, apostates are people who don't accept, or who could be violating certain aspects of Jewish law intentionally. A statement could be, it's not far to claim, for example, that the Reform movement would fall under the category of apostates. It's possible, for example. But look, this is in other words, it's important for you to see all the different all the possibilities within this text. Okay?
And then they'd be thrown in and not taken out.
That's right. They can even be thrown in.
You're killing them.
Yeah, you're not killing them, literally. You're putting them in a pit and then nature kills them. You're killing them. It's a very rough text. Very, very rough text. And it's in the books. I'm not saying this is the only opinion in the books, but this is one of the opinions in the books. Keep on reading. Whereupon Rabbi Yochanan said, wow.
I've been learning with the words, and so shalt thou do with every lost thing of thy brother, thou mayest not hide thyself.
This is the law.
Are also applicable to an apostate.
Are also applicable. What happens? There is a law in the Bible that if you see, for example, if you're walking and you see something of your brother's property, you see lost property, you're not allowed to take it to yourself. And you're also not allowed to ignore it. You have to bring it into your home and take care of it until your brother comes and finds it. That could even mean a headache of dimensions which you never couldn't imagine. Because in those days, you're not just finding a piece of clothing, you can find a cat. You can find your brother's sheep. You find a roaming animal. You have to bring it into your house and take care of it. Then your brother pays you back. But he pays you back only for the amount of food you spent. He doesn't pay you back for your effort. That's what it means being belonging to the same people. You're part of my people, I have to care for you. So caring for you is also being responsible for your property. Now he's saying that responsibility is called lotit alevehem. You can't ignore it. You can't, very often that people how we drive past the homeless in America. The door goes, I don't see anything. And the Jewish are, that's not the way you treat the Jewish people. Your community has a different system of responsibility. Now he's claiming that in the previous theory it says that an apostate, what could you do to him?
Throw him in a pit.
Throw him in. He's saying, quite the contrary. The apostate is who? Is your brother. And therefore, even though you have that diversity of opinion, you have to accept him and have the respect of him in that sense. You don't have to respect what he stands for, but you have to respect him as a person.
Okay, could he not have answered that the one might apply to the kind of apostate who eats carrion meat to satisfy his appetite, and the other to an apostate who eats carrion meat to provoke?
Okay, what's the difference? There are two types of apostates. One apostate you can throw in, and one apostate who is your brother. What's the difference?
Your brother you don't throw in.
No, you're right. Now, which apostate what apostate becomes your brother, and what apostate becomes
The intent.
the intent of what?
His intent
When he sins, what's the difference? The person who was
One eats out meat and the other
profane.
I'm just revolted or whatever.
No, the language here is very... See, the question is, we have to be... How accurate do you want to be in the language here? Who is the only apostate? The apostate who does what? Who eats when?
Keeps carrying meat.
But when does he eat chazir? When does he eat pork?
On Yom Kippur.
On Yom Kippur.
No.
That's the provoke.
Maybe he dies of hunger and there's nothing else to eat. It's not a matter of he has no choice. So he eats it. just to satisfy his hunger. And I think it's what. And the other one does it deliberately.
Spite. This could be this. Saul could be right. See, we can read it that way, and then what would be the implications of Saul reading? Because now what happens is you have to realize when you're reading texts, the whole beauty of reading texts is there isn't. The meaning of it is not obvious. And there's ways Saul is reading it. He's right. It depends what side do we want to read first. If we read the one side that Saul read first, only the person who eats it out of what? And satisfy his appetite, according to Saul, satisfy his appetite means he has a need. He's hungry, I'm starving, I'm allowed to sin if I'm starving. Anybody else who eats for any other reason doesn't qualify. That's one reading.
Would it have anything to do with translation or not? I mean,
no, you can probably.
No matter what.
Yeah, you could lahakis. There could be no what other reading. That's the way Saul would read the appetite. It's the Hebrew term is te'avon, which means appetite. And there's a difference. In other words, you're giving a very, very hard reading of te'avon, which could be. What could be another reading of this text?
The food appealed to him.
The food appealed to him. That's the food appealed to him. That would be the other reading of B'te'avon. That would be what B'te'avon means. B'te'avon means is that I like it. I don't need it, but I like it. Why do I do this? Why do I like it? Because I like it. What would be the only category of an apostate? The only reason why you eat it is what? To get you angry. I don't like it. I can understand it. It makes me nauseous, but I'm going to eat it in front of you. Just to show you I'm going to eat it in front of you. Now, one of the few places where I have ever witnessed an apostate to provoke is in the state of Israel. It's one of the few places. In diaspora, I have never encountered it. Ever. I have never encountered somebody who was a Jew who violated the system to get other Jews angry. Here in Israel, sometimes, because the battles and the struggles are so intense, it is the only place where sometimes you encounter it. But then according to this reading, Khalid's reading, and we'll let Solomon even work it out himself later, the whole notion here is that according to Saul, almost everybody would fall into the category of the apostate, except for the person who sins out of need. According to Edie's reading, almost nobody would fall into the category of an apostate except that person who was violating Jewish law to provoke other Jews. Now, that would be the two readings. Now, but this is only what Rabbi Yochanan, the first theory, gave a theory saying that the apostate. See, what happens is that you have numerous stages of the Talmud. Stage number 1, you have someone giving one opinion. Stage number 2, you have someone giving another opinion. In stage 3, they try to see if they can get the two opinions together, even though they don't necessarily agree. So it could very well be that we have here a theory which says that someone who is an apostate, someone who violates the law, is not part of your community. You don't have to care about it. You have nothing to do with it. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's not true. You are part of your community and part of your brothers. And according to then we have the division about how we want to read it. But then what we do see here is that there's a very strong foundation. Not every disagreement, because Jews do it, doesn't become Jewish. Hillel and Shammai are the words of the living God. But because a Jew does it, it's possible that a Jew could be an apostate. It's possible for one Jew to be an apostate. That's what we say. I'm not going to be pluralistic in acceptance of you or enable you any position in my community, and I'm going to do everything that I can to undermine you. Okay, I'll be very liberal now. I won't throw you in a pit, but I'm going to undermine your legal authority instead. That would be the other.
In this context, we're talking about something that is abnormal. It's almost contrary to normal human behavior, eating carrion meat.
Normal human behavior?
It's rare. Carrion, I assume, is putrefied meat.
No.
Oh, then I misunderstand. What is carrion?
It's not
Just
carrion.
a diet of itself without shechita.
Just a trait.
It's
Not slaughtered ritually.
But it could be slaughtered non-ritual.
Yeah. Armor's meat.
That would be. So it's not an anomaly at all. Now the discussion goes into
But the literal meaning of carrion.
That might be your meaning of carrion, but that's not their meaning.
Animal that died of itself as opposed to
That's not their meaning of carrion at all. Okay? Now, let's turn to page 4. 4.
What follows this?
After this session, we break and we come back dinner at 6:30.
There's not going to be another...
There's not going to be another discussion. No, we're just going to conclude here in the individual studies. There was a debate between Hillel and Shammai. The question is, one of the arguments which is very often presented is that Hillel and Shammai, they disagreed, but it's not like the disagreements we have today. The disagreements we have today, well, that's very different. According to you, according to the Reform movement or the Conservative movement, you're creating bastards, and you're doing things, and you're creating Jews who aren't Jews. It's not like, do I think I should have a sukkah, how big my sukkah should be, and how high my top should be, and this is the question, is my extra kosher this way, my extra kosher that way? That's the argument that we have. But today we have distinctions which are so fundamentally large that there's no way we can tolerate them. Hillel and Shammai can tolerate each other, but we can't tolerate each other given our disagreements. But it's not so. And one of the most, really a fascinating discussion in Tractate Yevamot, right before the discussion we had before, says as follows. That Shammai permit...
Second paragraph.
Second paragraph. Just 1 second. Do you know what? Let's start at page 6. It might be easier starting from there. We can do it from page 6. It might be a little better. Who'd like to read? Anybody? Any volunteers? Thank you, Jim. I love that.
Beth Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beth Hillel, nor did Beth Hillel refrain from intermarrying with Beth Shammai. Rather, they acted with truth and peace, as it is said. Love, truth, and peace.
We have this cryptic statement, which I want to get back to soon. Beit Hillel married people from Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai married people from Beit Hillel. You might say, what's the big deal? Of course. Because I can marry someone who disagrees with me on what type of lulav I should have, on whether I should, when I should sit, so how many candles I should light for Hanukkah. Beit Shammai says I should light from 8 going down to 1, and Beit Hillel says I should light from 1 going up to 8. That's the difference. We're both lighting candles, we can get married. That's no problem. But if there were more serious distinctions, I can't do it. I can't do it if you're Jewish, etc. You might think. So it says, no, they married, etc. They married each other, and they acted with truth and peace. It says love, truth, and peace. They wanted to create harmony with themselves. We don't know what that means. But then the Gemara asks, well, but how?
But how can you say this when issues of Mamzerut are involved?
How could you say that they married each other? What's a Mamzer?
Somebody born out of marriage, out of wedlock.
Someone who was born not out of wedlock.
That's a Christian.
That's a bastard. That's of an adulterous relationship.
No, that's a national definition of a mamzer. Yes.
No. A mamzer.
You've used it.
There's a mamzer. There's a technical legal definition of a mamzer. That is a child who was born as a result of an adulterous relationship. Now, a child who was born,
or incestuous.
Or incestuous, correct. Incestuous or adulterous relationship. Now, someone who is a mamzer can't be married by another Jew. For example, this is not a minor issue. Today, there's a major problem. If, for example, Orthodoxy does not accept the divorces of the conservative reform movement, then according to Orthodox law, they're still married. And if they're still married, they get divorced, they remarry, they have more children, and according to Orthodoxy, what are they? Mamzers, and therefore Orthodoxy might say, I have great difficulty marrying anybody who doesn't come from the Orthodox movement. That could be a modern. If you're a mamzer, an additional mamzer is a major problem. This is a real mess. But we're not the first ones who have that. It's a real mess. It's an unbelievable. Now there are solutions, and I'll tell you about them. Moshe Feinstein came up with solutions. There's Moshe Feinstein who came up with a solution saying that, you know what? Since I can't accept their divorces, I'm going to have a big problem. Because then Orthodox and conservative reform can't marry each other. You know what? I'm not going to accept their marriages. So I'm going to claim they were never married. So if they were never married, then they never got divorced. If they're never married, they didn't need a divorce. Therefore, you know what? We have a bunch of illegitimate children in the Christian sense, but in the Jewish sense, they're perfectly legitimate. They're acceptable, and there's no problem. He got help for that one to no end. But he decided one of the major things that he stood for was one of the. He said, this category. Jews who can't marry Jews is something that I can't tolerate. And he was innovative on that in a radical way. In other ways, he had no great love for the conservative reform movement at all. But on this, he said, it can't be that Jews should be able to marry each other. And so he was very radical on that, and he took a lot of flack for that. But so he got away with it for that reason. But This same problem which we have today was also a problem for Hillel Shammai. So according to Hillel Shammai, the question is when you get married, you have to give. You sanctify a woman to you, and it has to be done over something. It has to be done over something which has value. That's why you give someone a ring. The ring has to be shaveh, has to be worth a certain amount of money. Now Hillel and Shammai disagreed on how much money is supposed to be worth. Seems like a minor discussion. I thought if Hillel said one thing there, now what happens? If someone gives a certain, let's say it's supposed to, according to Shammai, Hillel is supposed to be $1. According to Shammai, it's supposed to be $5. So if I give you a ring for $1, according to Hillel, you're not. According to Shammai, you're not.
Unless it's a $5.
Excuse me, unless it's the $5, right? So that's, and therefore, what's the case? One might betroth a woman with a pruta, a small coin, and a second might subsequently betroth her with a dinar, a larger coin. Keep on reading. So in the opinion, right.
In the opinion of Beth Shammai, she is betrothed to the second man, and any offspring of the first would be a mamzer. According to Beth Hillel, she is betrothed to the first man, and any offspring of the second would be a mamzer.
And it's not just this issue. There are numerous other cases which I don't want to get into. There are different cases of places where marriages are permitted according to Hillel and they're not permitted according to Shammai. And so, in fact, even though they all seem to be playing the same game, the reality is that the disagreements between Beit Hillel and Shammai on small issues could in fact create, just like today. In other words, it's not, even though they might be wonderful, they're creating distinctions where it's a mamzer, so how could they marry? Could they or could they not marry each other? The question is, could they marry? And we're now going to see a whole list of attempts to deal with how do we deal with this disagreement of opinion. Now the answers have tremendous implications for creating a unified community within the Jewish people. Because if Hillel and Shammai married each other, even though they were mamzers, what was it that they had that enabled them to do that? And how could we look at that disagreement? The first end, we're going to stay on page 6. Rabbi and Shmuel differed on how to resolve this. Because we have at the beginning of the text we just read, Beit Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beit Hillel, nor did Hillel refrain from marrying people from Beit Shammai. So how could this be? How could I marry someone who says, I can't marry a conservative Reform Jew anymore, that's it, finished, can't. Rav and Shmuel differed. Read.
Rav said, both sides acted in accord with the authoritative halakha of Beth Hillel.
What does Rav say? How did Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai live together, marry each other? Because what?
Both live under the authority of the halacha.
In other words, the halacha follows whom? Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagreed where only in the study halls. They went outside to practice. They all followed the practices of Beit Hillel. In other words, there really was no disagreement of opinion, nor was there disagreement of practice in the Jewish community. We were one monolithic community. This, by the way, is one of the greatest myths which was ever created. It's not true. But it's okay. But he's, for the sake of this, he's saying it's basically impossible if they disagreed legally to create marriage, and therefore, in fact, they disagreed in theory, but in practice, Beit Shammai accepted the actions of Beit Shammai. But along comes Shmuel and says, no.
Now, was it Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel?
Yes, would be him and then his students which came after him. It represents a certain train of thought.
And I would assume that Beit Hillel says that you are married with a peruta?
Yes.
Minimum. So then that's why both acted in accordance with Beit Hillel.
Exactly. They accepted the minimal standard. It costs less to get married. Cheaper weddings, right. It was a cheaper wedding. Yes, he's all nervous about this. He doesn't know how lucky he's having kids getting married in Israel. Come to
We thought we were finished with bar mitzvahs. Now we got to share the wedding.
When is it?
Sometime in June.
Next year.
Mazel tov.
They have to sell the stuff.
See, they say Mazel Tov, they're worried about the cost. It's all different relationships. Okay, let's go. I know.
I don't think you are. I don't believe you.
Don't believe.
Okay. Shmuel said
each school acted in accord with his own rule.
Now that is probably the fact. We have in fact that they acted according to their own rule. We had diversity of practice. So how could they marry each other?
But how can you say this when issues of mamzerut are involved?
It's impossible. What's the answer? Greatest answer. Great answer.
What is it that he watched over them and no such cases ever
Phenomenal. Now who wants to tell me what this means? What do you think this Is this a historical statement?
No.
It's obviously not a historical statement. Shmuel living about, 400 years after Hillel, have 400 or 500 have historical documentation that it's never happened. So, impossible. How does he know? What is it? Miracle never happened? How does he know that never happened? What does he state? What does this statement do? Because it's an unbelievably revolutionary.
Is it legitimizing Mamzerut, which is divine?
What is it? No. What is he? What is it? When he says it never happened, what does he say?
It never arose. He didn't say it never happened.
That there was never a problem where someone from Hillel had to marry someone from Shammai. That someone from Hillel and Shammai got married to each other when they shouldn't have married, is what he's basically saying. How does he know that it never happened?
Because if all the marriages were done according to halakha,
That's right. The problem is we have two halakhas here.
but you have one authoritative.
But no, that's right. Shmuel says no. The truth is we have two authoritative halakhas.
But didn't we earlier say that Shammai also accepted the halakha?
That was one of them. Okay. You know what I want you to do is I want you to take a stop here, and I want you to read two other texts, because I think it'll help us understand the complexity of what's going on here. Turn. And I know I'm having you, by keeping your mind a lot of texts all at the same time, but it's important to have a deeper understanding. Let's turn to page 8. This comes from Tractate Rosh Hashanah in the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, I'd like to read 1, 2, 3 paragraphs from the top, the second line, after the number 10. Has it not been taught? Take your time, find it. Third paragraph, 1, 2,
It's not being taught.
After the number.
It's not being taught.
Right, does everybody
As
see
a
it?
general principle, the halakha follows Beth Hillel.
Okay, so general principle, what is the law? The law follows whom? Hillel.
If one prefers, however, to adopt the rule of Beth Shammai, he may do so. And if he desires to adopt the rule of Beth Hillel, he may do so.
He said there was one halacha. What is this text telling you?
Well, there are two interpretations of the same halakha.
And two ways, and you could choose which one you want to pick. What can't you do? What you can't do is this. One, however, who adopts.
One, however, who adopts the more lenient ruling of both Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel on the same subject is a bad man.
It's evil. Right.
While
If you're looking for, I want to find whatever is the easy. I want the easy way out. It's like, I'm going to go shop for a rabbi. It's called dial a rabbi. You know what I mean? Let's go find the one who'll give me the easy rulings.
Right.
I want you. I have you on. And I know on kosher issues I got you. On other issues I got you. I pick a rabbi from whoever gives me the lenient theory. That's evil. The person who
while to one who adopts the more stringent rulings of both Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel may be applied to the verse. But the fool walketh in darkness.
someone who says, what do I want to do? What do I want?
I want a tough life.
Not a tough life. What does he think? He thinks that if you do what?
If you close your eyes or if you don't walk in the dark.
If you pick which opinion?
The most difficult.
The most difficult, you're being more what? Holy. Religiously authentic. In other words, the more difficult opinion is more probably what God wants. That would be the theory. And this is not a myth. There's tremendous parts of the Jewish community which believe that if something is easier, it's probably not authentic. That Judaism has to be more difficult. That I want to accept the stringent rulings on each issue. He says, if that's what you do. If you're looking for stringent thought, if what guides you is difficult, what are you? You're a what?
Religious man.
No, that would be what you think. That's your definition. And I love you for saying that because that's our inclination. We see you. It doesn't matter. So what if you're so you're so from you don't even need I don't know where. It could be that you're being far less religious by doing that. That accepting the stringent rulings, what do they call him? You're what? A fool. Because if you're looking, that's not the way it works. I think God has there to create a system to try to whatever's difficult, that's better. Because there's an issue. On each issue, you have to decide. Sometimes the stringent is more, it depends on the issue. Okay?
No, either one must follow Bet Shammai both where they are more severe and more lenient, or Bet Hillel both were where they are more severe and more lenient.
Okay, now we go back to our text. So we see that there was an existence of action. There was diversity of practice in this. Correct? Now.
Wait a minute, I got a question. You're saying the more difficult is the way God wants you to go. Correct?
Right.
No.
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 The more difficult
It's not.
opinion. It's not.
It's not. You're supposed to follow, you're supposed to accept the philosophical legislation of a religious leader and follow it. Both could be more stringent or more lenient. It's not the issue of what's more stringent or more lenient. The question is, what's the issue?
If you're a follower of Bet Hillel, you'll do it both ways, whether it's lenient or difficult or vice versa.
Exactly. And therefore, so what we see here is that in fact, according to this opinion, we'll see later that there was also, I don't know if we'll have time, there was also an opinion which accepted rabbi, saying that you can practice differently. So then that there is diversity of practice. So now let's go back to page 6. So what then is this answer? The video you watched over them and no such case ever arose on page 6. What would that be?
They followed one or the other.
But then if they followed both, then how is it that we know by definition that there was never any problem? Any thoughts? What kind of answers? Here you have to get the smell. Try to be creative readers of what this could be.
Maybe there are problems, but God still watches over.
How do you know? How do you know they married? You didn't keep records. I didn't keep records. Right? Now, how does Shmuel, 400 or 500 years after Hillel, say, don't worry, I know they married each other, but God watched to make sure that there was never a case where someone married someone who, according to their theory, they shouldn't have married? How does he know that?
Because they got divorced.
No, he doesn't know that. How does he know? The answer is he doesn't know that. Right? He can't know that, so what is he claiming?
He hopes.
He hopes. Is he saying it's just a hope, or what is he claiming? It's stating a fact. It's called a myth. It's called a legal fiction. He's saying never happened. Never happened.
But I'm having to substantiate.
Never happened. God watched over. God won't enable any. Don't worry. Don't check. You don't have to worry about it. That's God, but whose business is it basically to protect us from this?
God.
Don't check. Don't keep black books about where you lived, who your rabbi was, whether you were in a conservative shul or a reform shul. I don't want to check. You don't check. It's God's business. It's not your business to watch over. He's creating a legal fact by saying God made sure that it never happened. It's a decision. See, this isn't a statement of fact. It's a religious decision to accept and to recognize that if we would not accept each other in that sense, we would be discontrolled. Therefore, I'm saying, you know what? You're fine, because if we got married, how do I know we're fine? If an Orthodox and a conservative Jew got married, how do I know that it really is fine? According to Shmuel.
Because they got married.
And therefore?
Therefore, it's fine.
And because what? Because whose job is it to watch over them?
God.
God's job, it's not your job. Is there a sense when he's saying, what he's basically is we have a problem. But the consequence of the problem is much too severe for us to deal with. In a fundamental, because the implications of it is just too broad. Jews not being able to marry Jews, ludicrous. So, never happens. How do I never happen? Because God will never let it happen. It's not
But
really
is
the
that
job.
applicable in 1991?
You tell me.
I don't think so. Well, for instance, when the Ethiopians came, the issue of are they Jews arose. So it wasn't God's business. They made it.
Your question is it applicable? Is it dual? Is it separate? It's two different questions. The question could be empirically or ideally. Do we function this way? No. Can we function this way?
Of course.
Yes. What enables you to function this way?
God makes you function.
No. Why would you choose to enable believing? It's a decision. It's a simple decision. It's a decision to say, I don't have to check people because God watches out to make sure that someone who should have won't marry someone they should have married. It's God will make sure. And if they got married, then it's not going to something is okay. They were married. It's not. I don't have to check because the ramifications ramifications of it, which is something which would destroy the Jewish people. And in fact, that's what's happening today. It's a decision. It's a leap of faith in a deep sense. Beyond. What's the decision I want to make? Yes?
Is he bringing this into contemporary life, or is he just saying, we'll determine practice today, but what happened yesterday is not going to affect the lives of the people who practice?
Good question. I'm not sure. I'm not certain. To the best of my knowledge, these types of diversity of opinions continued throughout Jewish history on numerous different issues. The diversity of opinions wasn't the monopoly of Ekron Beit Shammai. You continually had diversity of opinions throughout. It went from them to their students, to their students' students, throughout history. Rabbi Shmuel and people disagreed continuously.
The Commentary magazine, a dozen years ago, sent a list of 15 or so questions to the various rabbis, both Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, and so on. Their answers on various, submit your answers on the various questions. And it was amazing to see the diversity of thought within the opinions of the Orthodox rabbi and the conservative and the Reform. And in many cases, you couldn't tell who was what.
It was similar, you mean?
Yeah, many
The answers were similar?
In many cases, they crossed each other.
I read a
Remember
series.
that?
The book is called Condition of Jewish Belief. It was published, and Milton Himmelfarb ran it. And his conclusion, on the contrary, at the end, was there's only two Jewish beliefs, what we call Orthodox, and all the others are the same. And how they defined it was that Orthodox are those who believe written and oral Torah are the unchangeable Word of God, and all the others agree that they are changeable according to the whim of the Jewish people, but some are conservative, they like old ways, and others like to try new things, but they all agree that they can be changed. That was Himmelfarb's, the book is published, it's called Condition of Jewish Belief. No, he said Orthodox is distinct, and conservative Reformer Reconstructionists all believe the same thing, with the exception of Jacob Neusner in that book, who was in the religious mood at the moment. And
Okay, good. Turn to page 5.
I have the book. It's very interesting. You can get it from the American Jewish Committee.
Okay.
I quoted it in the question sheets all the time.
Okay.
Just a little bit off the subject, but since I think we're leaving Mamzerim alone,
Not yet.
I always had a problem with why the Mamzer himself should be subjected to non-acceptance in the community when it's not his fault that he was born.
I have no answer.
I always found it such an unjust law.
According
that
to,
the punishment
let me
should
just
be
give you one
parents as
answer.
opposed
I don't want to
to
get into the
child.
issue of mamzer. It will take us away
No,
from
okay,
it. So
I
just
thought
one
they might-
answer.
yes.
There is a medrash which says, to the best of my knowledge, that in the future, God will bring the rabbis to trial for not having alleviated the suffering of the mamzer.
Medrash Rabbi Kohelet.
Medrash Rabbi
On the verse, I have seen the oppressed under the sun, Ecclesiastes. And he says, who are the oppressed? The Mamzerim. Who are their oppressors? The Badatzer, the Rabbanut Rashid.
It's a fascinating medrash because the laws of mamzer were put into the Torah. But it was the rabbi's authority, God said. It's their authority to make it applicable in life. And if you kept that injustice on the books, it's your responsibility, not mine, for giving
Not only
it.
that, is it true that if a man commits the sin of adultery, his child is not considered only the woman?
Again, that's because your notion of adultery is American instead of Jewish. Under Jewish law. Under Jewish law, a man is allowed to have more than one wife.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but not somebody
Yeah, but
else's
what
wife.
happens?
No, but not someone else's wife.
Yeah,
but
but
what
he
happens
has
if he
somebody
doesn't-
else's wife?
Then it is adult. Then it is
What
adult.
happens if he doesn't marry her? He just has
The child is not a mamzer.
The child is not considered.
A mamzer. Now, it's not necessarily something which is
If he doesn't
permitted.
marry her, it's
Right.
It's just illegitimate.
It's just
It's not illegitimate in Jewish.
Under Jewish law, there's no
No,
state.
no,
It has no category.
no,
By
no.
laws, that you know, but under Jewish law, it's not illegitimate.
But if she was married.
that would really encourage, I mean, that would
More children.
encourage.
Licentiousness, well, again, in the Talmud and the Chumash, it speaks about how if you do sleep with someone that you have to then marry them, you have to pay the father, and you're never allowed to divorce them. In other words, so it wasn't like, free for, it's one of the people sometimes only learn half the text and don't look at the other half. In fact, in the Jewish biblical law, a man is allowed to have sex with a woman outside of marriage, but then he has to marry her and he's never allowed to finish. So it's a whole thing.
But what if he's already married?
Rabbi Rashi say it's involves it's forbidden to have any sexual relation outside of marriage. And religious young people will not even dance with the opposite sex till they're married, with their own wives. And
Let's hold that. Okay. Now
others say it's permitted to Rabbi.
Let's go to Sefer Yevamot, page 5. Even though this is one of the most radical texts I have ever seen in my life, so get prepared. Okay? Who'd like to read one of the most radical texts I've ever seen in my life?
I will.
Go. I remember when I taught this class here at the Mahon, this text at the Mahon, 11 years ago. It was the first class I gave at the Mahon. And I remember interpreting this text 11 years ago, and people flipped. Angry at me at how I was being somewhat serious. It's impossible for me to say that. What? This was part of the material of the text that we were studying. It was 11 years ago.
So I should apologize in advance.
No, just go. And the question is, what does it mean? And then I was saying something. It's not his fault. It's what it says, because the implications of this could be. It's go.
Even though Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagreed over questions of rivals, sisters, a doubtfully married woman.
These are different categories into which one said you're allowed to marry, and this is not allowed to marry, and issues of bastards, etc., would result.
Nevertheless, Bet Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Bet Hillel, nor did Bet Hillel refrain from marrying women from Bet Shammai. Rather, they acted with truth and peace among one another, as it is said, love truth and peace.
What is the answer?
Love truth and peace, whatever that is.
You tell me. What do you think this text means?
Sounds like they were licensed to marry whenever they wanted from the other.
Because of what? Because what? Because of what?
Because of love.
Because
Shalom.
Because peace. Now, what is peace? A money value. Where do we get the value of peace? What is he quoting here?
Zechariah.
In other words, a Jewish text. A Jewish text. In other words, the centrality of peace is not. You know what I mean? Oh, it's nice to be nice. Peace is like. But I'm not worried. There's Jewish values and there's peace and gentleness and kindness and ethics, etc. Narishkeit. This is what loving truth and peace is what. Is a Jewish value. It's yours. And therefore, if I wouldn't marry you, what would I be doing? I would be keeping halacha, but what would I also be doing? I'd be disobeying another aspect within the system. According to this theory, then, what is he claiming is more important than the legal distinctions between us? Peace. See, what he's saying is, wow, it's unbelievable. This
Again, those within the system.
Now the question is, now, is, okay, good. Now the question is that so? What's your first name?
Yaakov.
Yaakov says, what's so within the system? Is that true?
What's what?
Yaakov says, well, that would only apply to those within the system. Could be. Again, you'll find that in legal and philosophical discussion, there's no arm wrestle, where who wins in that sense. You could say it's only for those who apply within the system.
You have historical proof of it, because they did persecute the Sadducees. And
they did for Hillel and Shammai. You know, there's historical proof that Shammai killed Hillel. There's Yerushalmi, where the students of Shammai killed the students of Hillel once when they were fighting to control the Sanhedrin. There was one day, they wanted to control a monopoly on the Sanhedrin. The students of Hillel were outside, the students of Shammai ran in, closed the doors, and any student of Hillel who attempted to come up was killed.
That's awful.
I know it's awful. It's not just Sadducees. There's lots of proof. I see, I'm not saying here that this is what... You see, we're not arguing here that the Jewish people were this wonderful people who always had respect for diversity. That's not the issue here. I'm not arguing history. I'm trying to see to what extent we have a value system which is being taught, which we can use to change the way we treat as a legal foundation. I'm not describing what happened. I'm attempting to use this text to prescribe what ought to happen. And what this text is saying is that the value of peace is more significant than all the rest of the legal distinctions between us. And there'll be no distinction between whether I see you as Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, or whether I see you're a conservative, reformer, or Orthodox Jew. That would be. I'm not saying we can't disagree.
Doesn't follow.
No, of course you can follow, because the centrality of peace. It doesn't have to follow. The centrality of peace is saying that is more significant than the other one. So you know what? It's true. I disagree with you on this issue. I disagree with you on how you practice on X, Y, or Z. But there's something more important than my legal distinction. The problem then would be The problem would be, looking at the Jewish community, what becomes the priority? What is your major priority? Is your priority the legal system, in a certain sense? Or is your priority peace, which is a central notion of Judaism? One of the biggest problems which we face, I see today, is that there are numerous Jewish values which have stopped being perceived as Jewish values because they've sort of been controlled and taken over by the larger world.
By the what?
Larger world. What is Jewish? That has to be ritual. Something which is particularly ours. It's something that we share with other people. Very often you see, it's not really Jewish. It's universal. That's the universal garbage. But I'm interested in the Jewish stuff. These come along and say there's something more important. Hillel and Shammai recognized it. Even though it's mamzer, fundamental important issues of God is something more important to me and to our community and to our people. And it's not something external, it's something just essential to our tradition. I can't follow the law without violating a more important principle, and that is the principle of peace and centrality. That would be, now this is the radical, hardest reading possible of this text. I see it, obviously, in my pluralistic spirit, as the only reading possible. I was just teasing. There could be other readings with it. Yaakov is saying that this could only apply again within the context of who it is that you agree with. Yes. Okay, it's something you really got to say.
Real quick,
You got it.
It's love, truth, and peace. And as I understand it, it's only to love peace when it doesn't violate truth. The fact that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagree, Beit Hillel can't say Beit Shammai is false because he's also seeking truth within the Torah system. But if I just love peace and ignore truth, if I would take something out of the system as I believe it, which just doesn't ignores the authority of the Torah, it doesn't just say love peace, there must be truth with